Right, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you, even though I can't see you. I'm sure you're looking fabulous. Welcome to this exciting webinar on access arrangements. Could you all just send me a yes to make sure that you can hear me okay? Great, thank you, Rothio. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tracy. That's fantastic. Okay, so that's good to know. People can hear me. So I have been sponsored by Scanning Pens today to talk to you about access arrangements. This was postponed from last week. Many apologies for that. I had a nasty cough and it wasn't attractive at all. And it is better, but if I suddenly mute myself, it's because I'm coughing my lungs up somewhere, and I'll try to do it quietly. So today we are going to talk about access arrangements, and as I say, it is an hour, so it's kind of a whistle-stop tour. However, it will be open to questions at the end, and also if you've got any long involved questions, my email address will be on at the end. Please feel free to email me with any queries at any time at all. That's not a problem today. So I'm going to talk to you about JCQ access arrangements in the main, but I will also be referring to the Cambridge access arrangements, CIE, for their exams as well. So these are the documents that I have referred to. They've nicely formed them in basically one handbook. Well, Cambridge have got two handbooks. That's there for your reference. So let's start with the JCQ and what underpins the main or all of the JCQ regulations is the Equality Act, which came into being on the 1st of October 2010 and drew together lots of discriminatory legislation. And I certainly have seen an increase in access arrangement applications since then, and I'm sure you have too. But the key is the disability, the definition of a disability, because technically speaking, according to JCQ regulations, candidates must be disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act in order to qualify for an access arrangement. So they define a disability as a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on that person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And that is the key word here, substantial. It has to be a substantial impairment, okay? And it's got to be long-term. So it's got to have lasted or is going to last for 12 months or more. JCQ also say that it shouldn't affect the assessment integrity. The whole point is that what we are doing with access arrangements is we are making sure that students aren't hindered in demonstrating their knowledge. So that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing, is demonstrating their knowledge in exams. So we have to make sure that they're not unfairly hindered by any difficulty or disability that they have in demonstrating that knowledge. But the major assessment principles have to apply. Now, JCQ are very keen on independent working, and personally, I am very keen on independent working as well. I would rather not have a human reader or a human scribe, if at all possible, because we have to look at preparing for life after school, not just passing exams. But one of the major keys is that it has to be their normal way of working in school. Now, normal way of working in school trumps everything. Normal way of working in school trumps any private report, which I will talk about later. Normal way of working trumps a doctor's letter or a paediatrician's letter. Normal way of working in school trumps anything. So basically, if you get a letter outlining a condition that the school weren't even aware existed, and this student is pretty much hitting targets, then you should not be awarding an access arrangement because it's not their normal way of working. And also the argument could be, well, actually, if the school didn't even know that this difficulty existed, how much of a substantial impairment is it? Okay. What does count as normal way of working with regard to JCQ is they said it can be what happens in the classroom, but they've added where appropriate this year, because you're not always aware of difficulties just in the classroom. Very rarely do kids actually sit and write for sort of 2 hours or 1 hour at a time in a classroom. So their substantial difficulty may not arise just from in the classroom. The key element is that the SENCO or pastoral staff or people in the school should have a history of support for this student that has existed. They should have a history of intervention strategies, of withdrawal lessons, of support, of needing help for reading and writing. They shouldn't just suddenly pop up just before the exams take place, because then it's not their normal way of working. This is going to be a little controversial, and I'm sure some of you are already thinking, right, okay, can we talk about this a bit more? I will talk about this a bit more, because particularly with regard to things like exam anxiety, which I'm going to address further down the presentation. It's also very similar with regard to Cambridge. They say that, again, the access arrangement is to remove any barriers so the candidate can be recognised for their attainment and their knowledge. And that they also say that it should be a permanent or long-term disability or difficulty. But it can also be a temporary illness, and obviously with JCQ, you can have temporary emergency applications in incidents where, I don't know, they've done something crazy the night before their GCSE English and gone hand gliding down a mountain or something and broken something. That's absolutely perfectly okay. CIE also want you to consider normal way of working, so they want you to consider the arrangements the candidate uses every day and to access internal assessment as such as mock exams. Okay, so that is important. Again, the normal way of working trumps anything. CIE and JCQ both say that you should recruit with integrity. So any students that have difficulties or special educational needs, your SENCO or you should be getting involved in year 9 or year 8 in the options evenings to discuss whether this course is suitable. So you should be looking at the beginning of the course whether they are going to be able to access all of the assessment requirements at the end of the course, okay? And if not, you need to discuss it at the beginning. A perfect example is where I know a school had a student with a physical disability, but he wanted to do product design, and they said you won't be able to access some of the testing, the actual making of your product design, and you're not entitled to an exemption for that or an access arrangement to help. And so he said that's fine because this is my vocational subject, my fun subject, and all the other academics, so I am happy with that. So that is what's called recruiting with integrity, making sure that the issues don't arise just before the exams take place. So let's now have a look at what the main access arrangements are. The first and key one, which should always be looked at first, is supervised rest breaks. It's very underused. Extra time is currently the most used access arrangement, but very often supervised rest breaks should be more suitable, actually a better access arrangement for the student. So anybody who tires easily or hand starts to ache but they want to write it themselves, you should be looking at giving them supervised rest breaks. Okay? You can also combine supervised rest breaks with extra time. So, you know, when you start looking at 50% extra time, 100% extra time, that's a lot and it is very tiring. And it may be more suitable that they have 25% extra time and a supervised rest breaks put in place as well. What will happen, I pressed that slide already, sorry. What will happen is that you stop the exam for that person, take the paper off them, and restart it when they're ready. What they do in that supervised rest break is generally depends on what their requirement is. So if it's a diabetic thing, they may eat, or if they have anxiety and you have the resources, you can take them for a walk, or they may just like to sit there and rest. If they have hypermobility joints or something like that, they may just like to sit there and rest their hands while they're doing nothing. So this is much more suitable for students who tire easily. You don't want to make the exam last longer if people get tired. With regard to deciding the length of the supervised rest breaks, well, CIE say no time recommendations, but I think a good practice is to go by the JCQ regulations that say the duration of the break should be decided by the SENCO beforehand. Now, obviously, this totally depends on what their need is. If it's going to be an emergency rest break situation, if they're epileptic or they're diabetic, then obviously you have to give them a rest break as and when they have that need. But generally, you can say, well, your normal way of working is that you need a rest break kind of after every hour for about 5 or 10 minutes. The situation you have to avoid is where the student opens their exam paper, reads the exam, and then says, oh, I'm going to take a rest break now, and that is then thinking time. Okay, so you're quite within your rights to say, no, you can work 30, 45 minutes perfectly well without taking a rest break. So somewhere around 45 minutes or an hour is when you take a rest break, and 5 minutes of that is sort of normal time of working. Don't worry, you can ask questions about this at the end, so don't panic if I've said something that you need clarifying. So then we get on to extra time, which is the big one, but JCQ are clamping down on the extra time requests that they have this year. Extra time is only for candidates who have processing, reading and comprehension speed, or writing speed difficulties. So it is only for candidates who think or work at a slower speed. I'm just going to mute while I just do a quick cough. Just bear with me. Sorry about that. So that is the only time you should award extra time, if they work or think at a slower speed. Okay. Now you can use it for chronic fatigue or ME type illnesses because those conditions aren't alleviated by rest, and so to help them they work at a slower pace. Okay, so basically the key is, do they work at a slower pace? If a short rest is going to help them, then that's where you give supervised rest breaks instead. So you can have 25%, 50%, or up to 100%. But you do have to think it has to be detrimental. Sometimes there have been cases where candidates have had extra time and haven't needed it. So they've gone through their answers, they've written their answers, and then they've checked them at the end, and they have this extra time. And what do we do when we start having extra time or too much time and thinking about things? We start doubting ourselves and doubting the answers we've written. And so it has been shown that sometimes if students have extra time and they don't need it, they actually go back and change some of their initial answers and get a lower mark. You can apply extra time to listening exams and to oral exams. That's perfectly legitimate. With regard to listening exams, you can either stop the CD during each question, or you can stop it at the end, or what you can do is have a live speaker for that listening exam who can talk at a slower pace. Okay, that is a perfectly legitimate use of extra time, and also having a live speaker is a centre delegated access arrangement as well. There are certain indication times where extra time cannot be used because the time assessment is part of the assessment. The timed thing that they're doing, the word has escaped me, is part of their assessment. And you do consider it subject by subject. I would imagine that most of your extra time is going to be used for your extended writing subjects such as English and history, and they may not need it for things like maths and science, but again it depends on their need. JCQ this time are wanting extra evidence for inspections when they do extra time applications, and I will be covering that a little bit further down the line. We then have a reader or a computer reader, so you either have a human reader or a computer reader, and this is obviously for students who have difficulty with reading. Now, I'm a big fan of using assistive technology. Students aren't going to have a TA or a human reader with them when they leave school, so let's prepare them for it now. Another advantage of having a computer reader is that it can be used for the English GCSE, whereas you can't have a human reader for the English GCSE reading paper section. And the reason for that is a human reader puts feeling and intonation and inflection in their voice, so they can give a little bit of a clue as to what the word is, even if they don't know what it is. A computer reader is a very, very robotic voice, and so no cue or clues are going to be given. Sorry if you can hear my cat meowing outside my door. So they can also, if you have a reader, they can read back answers if the student wants to have their own answers read back to them for clarity and clarification. So that's a reader and a computer reader. Then we have a scribe, and a scribe for JCQ is one of 4 options. Firstly, it's an adult who writes or types the candidate's dictated answers. And remember, if you have a scribe, a human scribe who can type, get them to type the answers on a word processor because that's easier than handwriting it. A scribe is also a word processor with the spelling and punctuation switched on, or it is a scribe recognition technology. So this is your e-readers, your computer readers. Or it is computer software which produces speech and is dictated to a scribe. This is for blind students who type their answers in Braille. So that's where that one comes in. And a scribe for CIE is basically similar. It's an adult who writes down or word processes the dictated answers. Voice-activated software such as Dragon, which is also allowed for JCQ. A transcript of a dictated tape also counts as a scribe. And whilst JCQ don't specifically mention that, you can use a dictation machine and type it up afterwards. For a scribe. And it says for CIE, scribe is not allowed in some papers unless they dictate each word and the use of a dictating machine. So this is the key, is by having a human scribe, you are going to lose marks for spelling and punctuation or your quality of written communication. Okay, so it really depends. You need to look at the spec. The spec for the subject will specify how many marks have been awarded for quality of written communication or spelling and punctuation and grammar. Now, I know that in one paper on the English GCSE, 20% of the marks are awarded for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So by having a human scribe, you are limiting access to 100% of the marks. So if a teacher says to you they need a scribe because their spelling isn't very good, is their spelling poor enough that you're happy for them to get no marks at all for any spelling? And what will happen is you will have a cover sheet to fill out to say whether they dictated punctuation, whether they dictated grammar, or whether they dictated spelling, and the examiner will award the marks based on that. So I always recommend using a word processor if the candidate is able to do that. It really is a much, much better option. Also, using a human scribe is horrible. And for those of you that haven't, I would like you to go out and do 2 things. 1 is scribe for somebody else. And 2 is have somebody scribe for you, because it's actually really, really difficult not to lose your track of thought, not to lose where you are, to speak at a speed of how somebody else is writing. It is really, really difficult. So most kids can use a QWERTY keyboard. So wherever possible, please give them a word processor instead. And when I say word processor, I'm talking about a word processor with the spelling and grammar switched off. If you use the word processor with the spelling and grammar switched on, that is a scribe application. If you use a word processor with the spelling and grammar switched off, that is a centre delegated, normal way of working access arrangement. Okay, it still has to be appropriate to the candidate's needs. It can't use a word processor just because they say, oh, I feel like using a word processor because I do it all the time. There has to be a learning need, of which also including that is messy handwriting. Messy handwriting is counted as a learning need for which you can use a word processor. Again, you can award a word processor on a subject-by-subject basis, and indeed, within the same paper, it is perfectly permissible to handwrite some of the answers and type some of the answers and attach it to it. So that's fine. Again, you could award extra time if the candidate has processing difficulties, which mean they type slower, and you have to apply in the normal 25% extra time guidelines. So that's JCQ word processor. With regard to Cambridge word processor, again, they say it must be the usual method of producing work, and if they are able to handwrite, they must do so. So they are again reinforcing that you can't just pick to use a word processor because you want to and you prefer to type. We then have transcripts, and that is whereby a student writes it themselves, and somebody who is familiar with their writing will write it out afterwards so it's clearer. JCQ don't permit this, and Cambridge do permit this, and it's centre delegated. Again, I'm not a fan because when they leave school, they're not going to have the luxury of somebody copying things out for them, so they should use a word processor wherever possible. A practical assistant is another quite common access arrangement. You need prior approval from both awarding bodies as to what the practical assistant is going to do. So what will happen with regard to JCQ is you will apply online and they will refuse, and then you will have to send them details of what you want the practical assistant to do for each exam, and they will then write back and say what is allowed to be done by the practical assistant and what isn't allowed to be done, because what will happen is that's part of what's being assessed, so it's not fair. So, you know, you can generally have a practical assistant for doing some of the science experiments, but not certain parts like mixing chemicals, or you can have somebody to hold a ruler. I had a practical assistant for a student with arthritis who was doing textiles, and the practical assistant was allowed to thread the needle and cut the thread, but not actually to do any part of the sewing. Do also consider a practical assistant if you've got the emergency access arrangement of students that have broken something, just to hold the paper, hold the ruler, anything like that is going to help. Okay, so then we have modified papers that are available. Just excuse me. So these are the modified papers that are available with Edexcel, JCQ, and for those of you from overseas, JCQ regulations are used for Edexcel exams. Now you do have to order them. The deadline to order them is before the exam entry deadline, so you have to be sure what they're going to do, and they are quite costly for the awarding bodies to do. So that's kind of why they're cutting down. But it doesn't mean to say that you cannot photocopy your own modified paper, enlarge a paper. The only thing you're not allowed to do is retype it out. If you are using a computer reader, order a non-interactive PDF, okay, and you only order one of those, and that will come on the morning of the exam, which would be you can then download to your computer, and that can be used there. Also, do consider ordering a non-interactive PDF if you have candidates who want their papers on a certain colour. So instead of photocopying onto the paper, what you can do is order an interactive PDF and print it out on the day of the morning of the exam straight onto that coloured paper, so you don't have to do as much photocopying. And then we have the Cambridge modified papers that they will provide for you as well. So let's quickly then look at the other arrangements that are available with JCQ. And as I say, don't panic. I know this is a little bit whistle-stop. We're kind of limited with time, but I will ask questions and I will be available for you to email with anything that comes up afterwards. So with JCQ, you also have an oral language modifier. Now, what an oral language modifier does is modify some of the carrier language that is in the exam to help students understand the exam better. AQA don't allow oral language modifiers because they say that their papers are already modified enough. If you are using an oral language modifier, and where they're very common is with hearing impaired students who use sign language and so tend to have a more limited vocabulary range. So if you do use an oral language modifier, they have to be trained, and there is online training available for places like Communicate. They also have to have a level 3 qualification in English before they do the training, so that's A-level or higher. They also have to mark on the exam paper which words they've changed, and there's strict rules as to the words they are allowed to change, which is why the training, and they are only allowed to change words when asked by the student. So you have to have a very low standardised score of 69 or below. So do consider actually whether GCSEs is suitable for them or not. We then have exemption, which is whereby regardless of every access arrangement you've tried to put in place, that student cannot access that part of the assessment. For example, if you had a deaf student who couldn't access a listening exam, they would be able to have exemptions for that. There are I know of several students who have got speech impediments or they stutter, and they have been allowed to have exemption from the English speaking parts of the exams. It has to be a complete unit in itself in order to get the exemption. One place where I know it wasn't allowed was there was a blind candidate who wanted exemption for part of his astronomy exam, and they said no, because actually part of the assessment was testing. You had to recognise the constellations. So exemption is specifically something that should be sorted out before they take the course, whether they're going to need it or not. You then have read aloud, where a student sits on their own in an exam room to read out the paper so they can understand. They have to hear themselves say it in order to process it. Just excuse me. And that is centre delegated. You also can have a reading pen, which I will talk about in a minute. You can have a prompter, which is a human person who helps keep a candidate focused. So if they have ASD or ADSD or easily distracted, and they can keep them on task, and that is a centre delegated. You can have a live speaker, which I have referenced as well earlier. It may be for hearing impaired, that they lip read slightly. It also needs having a live speaker so they can read at a slower pace, so they can process it easier. You have a sign language interpreter for deaf students. Alternative accommodation is available. That might be where they sit their exams at home because they have difficulty coming to school. You also have bilingual dictionaries. Now, just to be clear, any student whose first language, whose native tongue isn't English, can have a bilingual dictionary, no matter how long they have been studying the English qualification. The regulations come into place if you want extra time with the bilingual dictionary. Okay, and currently it's only 10%, and it's only to go with GCSE GCSEs, and there are strict regulations with regard to that, with the bilingual dictionaries, so have a look at that. Then you will have students who want a separate room in the school, and one of the main reasons for this tends to be exam anxiety. This is a very difficult area for schools to manage, really, because it is becoming a more increasing issue. I would personally prefer you to help students with exam anxiety in other ways rather than sitting them in a separate room, but it really depends on your school ethos, your SLT. Strictly speaking, students should not only sit in a separate room if they have a difficulty, a substantial difficulty impairment that is known to the school and meets the Disability Equality Act disability definition, of which generally exam anxiety doesn't. If it is a major anxiety and they're having CAM support and it's well known, then absolutely that is genuinely the case. But as I say, it's very stressful and you may be overruled, and sometimes it's easier just to say, okay, I'll put them in a separate room. There are many visual aids that you can use, including magnifying and things like that. And also colour naming is an option. You will have colourblind students in your school, and they can have the colours named to them by the invigilators, and that is centre delegated. The other arrangements, again, with Cambridge are very similar. You can have an alternative venue. Cambridge, do you say you can have prompter cards, which is also, you can put them on the desk in front of students rather than sort of disturb them physically. You can have exemptions. They also say you can use background music. So for students who maybe have tinnitus, that may be a suitable access arrangement for them. Colour naming, colour to overlays, live speaker, these are all very similar to the other ones with regard to Cambridge. And most of those are centre delegated. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the access arrangements available. What I also wanted to talk to you about today is saving yourself time with regard for applications, okay? So with regard to CQ and making applications, there are two routes you can go down, okay? First of all, there is the classic assessment route, which most of you will do the majority of your access arrangement applications through. So for 25% extra time, a computer reader or a scribe, you use Form 8. You detail the normal way of working with the evidence. You detail the history of needs, the history of support that you provided. And you have one assessment with a score of 84 below from year 9 or no later. It's then hand-signed by the assessor and the SENCO, and obviously you must have the data protection notice as well. So that is the most common route. But there is also the medical route, which a lot of people tend to not use, and they should use. So if you have any candidates on the autistic spectrum disorder who have hearing impairments, multisensory impairments, physical disabilities, visual impairments, social, mental and emotional help, speech, language and communication needs, so anything like ADHD can come in this, anything like dyspraxia can come in this. You go down the medical route, okay? So what you then have to do is, you don't use Form 8 and you don't need any assessment scores for this. So what you do is you do a centre-headed file note. So on headed paper, you write down the evidence of difficulties and that it meets their normal way of working. And so look at page 76 for extra time. It will highlight the 6 or 7 things you have to talk about. I confirm that they have a disability, that it's a substantial impairment, that they will be impaired without it or at a substantial disadvantage without it. Then you have the supporting medical evidence and the signed data protection notice. That's it. You don't need to do any assessment. For a lot of students, there isn't going to be an assessment which demonstrates the difficulties they have. For some of our SME students, they're not going to sit a test. They're going to swear at you and walk off. They should not be disadvantaged because they don't sit a test. There are also not tests available to show that an ASE student may need to straighten his paper and his pens. 5 times before he actually starts answering each question, or that an ADHD student may be distracted and so needs extra time because of that. So if you have a medical diagnosis, do go down the medical route. Okay. With regard to diagnosis letters, it depends on what their condition is. If it's a variable condition that may change, then a more recent diagnosis letter would be appropriate. If it's a diagnosis of ASD, you can use it from when they're about 7 or 8, because once you've got ASD, you've got ASD. And what you're then providing evidence for is the normal way of working. When you go online to make the application, it will say, tick the box. Do they have a medical diagnosis? Tick that, and they won't ask you for an assessment score at all. Okay, so a lot of people are missing going down the assessment route, medical route. Now, with JCQ, with regard to the assessment route and the medical route, if you are applying for extra time, they want a little piece of extra evidence with your Form 8 or with your centre-headed file note. So either a mock paper where they've changed colour pen after normal time to demonstrate the need for extra time, or comments from teachers, or an IEP, because they are trying to clamp down on the number of extra time applications. So they do want a little bit of evidence extra as well. To make a Cambridge application, okay, you have to use either Form 2 or Form 4 or Form 1, which is in the handbook. But again, a time-saving point here is if you already have a JCQ approval, you only need to complete the first page of the Access Arrangement Form 1 and attach the JCQ approval, and then they will accept it. So again, saving yourself time. So I'm trying to cover all the main elephants. Blimey, I'm not covering elephants. I'm trying to cover all the main elements here of access arrangements. So let's talk about who is allowed to assess, okay? Because I know this also causes you some areas of difficulty. Well done for staying with me as well, because this isn't the most exciting subject. So JCQ assessor regulations, okay? JCQ say assessors must only work in their area of expertise, okay? So if you're a specialist in hearing impairment, you can't assess for anything that's non-hearing related. They must have a level 7 postgraduate course in a specialist assessment, or have a current specific learning difficulty assessment practicing certificate, or be qualified psychologists and registered with the HCP. Now, with regard to level 7 qualifications, I know Real Training do one online, I know Communicated do one, and I know Patos do them. They're all available online or in person if you wanted to use those. JCQ will not allow privately commissioned assessments to be used unless they meet strict guidelines. Okay, so those guidelines is that first of all, before carrying out any assessment, the private assessor should contact the school, the SENCO, and ask where the areas of difficulty are for the student. They must then only test in those areas of difficulty that have been highlighted by the school. So what they cannot do is just do a blanket battery of tests. They should only test where the specific difficulty has been identified by the school. They should then only report back on the test scores. They shouldn't decide what the access arrangement should be put in place. That's up to the SENCO to decide. And also they have to provide copies of their qualifications with it. Okay, so you cannot have parents just sending in random privately commissioned assessments. You're not allowed to use them. Okay, so here is the slide on what I've just said. Pages 85 and 86 detail. When it comes to doing assessments, there are again regulations in the JCQ booklet which assessments you are allowed to use. The golden rule is you have to use the most recently standardised assessment. So once RAT 5 comes out, you have to stop using RAT 4. You have to use the latest version because it has to be recently standardized. If you're using external assessors, they have to contact the Senko before, they have to use up-to-date tests, and you have to make sure that you have copies of their qualifications. And the message needs to get out that no access arrangement is awarded purely based on the results of an assessment or purely based on a letter from a doctor. Okay? You have to do the internal investigation first into their normal way of working. CIE are a little bit more flexible with regard to who can assess for them. You can have a qualified psychologist, you can have a specialist teacher, but they will also accept a report by a qualified teacher who has at least 5 years work experience in the area of special needs. Okay, so whistle-stop tour there of access arrangements. This is my email address at the bottom. If you email me, I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides. What I'm now going to do is take questions from anybody. Can I clarify the use of a bilingual dictionary for GCSE English? Yes, I can. I'm just going to get my JCQ booklet out, because JCQ do list in their documents which exams you can use a bilingual dictionary for. Okay, so let's just bear with me. Anybody else, please keep typing questions. Okay, a bilingual translation dictionary must not be used in English language examinations, Irish or Welsh examinations, and modern foreign language examinations testing one of the languages of the dictionary or a similar language. Does that answer your question, Tracy? Excellent, excellent, that's good news. Any other questions at all? Lorraine is typing something. No, you can't. If English is being tested, you can't use a bilingual dictionary. No problem. I think what I might do is, have you all got microphones? Shall I open it up so we can have a discussion? Listen. Okay. Okay, I've put you all on open discussion, so if you have microphones, please feel free to speak. Tracy Redmond, we are a college and we are facing increasing difficulties, yes, in obtaining the original format, yes. Does anyone have any advice on how they manage it? When I'm training, I always recommend that a copy of the format is given to the student with their results to take to their next college. I know that colleges have a massive difficulty with this, and I have discussed this with Nick Lake from JCQ. And they sort of, again, they say that to keep the integrity of the process, you have to have the original format plus copies of the qualifications of the assessor that were used in the format. which is a bit pants and doesn't really help you there, Tracy. I always advise that if a student signed a data protection notice, and they've given permission for the next college to have their details, because the assessment belongs to the student, like the results belong to the student, not to the college, not to the school, so there's no reason they shouldn't release this. All I can suggest is you ask the student to get a copy of the Form 8, and even if you can't use that Form 8, at least you can use it to fill out Section A of the previous working history to do that. That doesn't really help, sorry. Yes, Rothio, Edexcel follow the JCQ guidance for access arrangements, because I know you're in Budapest. But what they do is they say, don't apply online, you have to email the documents to Edexcel at their address, and I can send you the address for that. I'll send you the address where to apply for with them. No problem. Any other questions from anybody? As I say, it's a whistle-stop tool, but you do have my email address, and I'm always getting queries about access arrangements, and it's not a problem at all. I'm absolutely happy to reply. What I didn't talk about, very badly of me, is actually the exam pen, the exam reader. I thought I had a slide in there about it. Jim, you didn't tell me I didn't have a slide. I did have a slide. I missed it because they've kindly sponsored this event. I thought I had a slide on it. But the advantages of using the exam pen with the Scanning Pen's exam pen is you don't need a Form 8 or any online application in order to use it. You can use it as a centre delegated, normal way of working, okay? So it saves you an awful lot of time. You don't need any assessment. You can use it for your EAL students as well. So that works really, really well for them. You can use it in the main hall. It comes with earphones. It's fantastic for independent way of working. It also reads a lot of different languages, so you can use it for modern foreign language exams as well, so students aren't hindered for those exams either. And as I say, no Form 8, centre delegated, normal way of working with regard to the exam pen. It's a one-off cost. You're going to save time and money with TAs, and also not having to assess students. So I know Scanning Pens do a free 30-day trial, and Jim, I'm sure, will contact you after to see if you're interested. Apologies, I don't know where that slide was, but it's a really good piece of kit and really worth looking at, and students get on very, very well with it. Oh, Jim's put the website up there. Please visit examreader.com and have a look at that. As I say, because it is going to save you a lot of time, a lot of staffing, a lot of assessment time, and it's an independent way of working. But again, it's really good for your EAL students. Okay, if there's no other questions from you fabulous people, thank you very much for listening. Please do go to, oh, Sarah's typing me something now. Exam Reader. Oh, thank you, Sarah. And please go to examreader.com. I apologise for the husky voice. It wasn't quite sexy. It was more diseased, but next time hopefully it'll be better. So thank you for listening, everybody, and I hope you have a good week.